Look at this pathetic sight. A pregnant rat trying to hide in a palace. The sound of the slap landed louder than the $5,000 a plate dinner service. The collision of a man's palm against a woman's cheek, that specific, ugly crack cut through Vivaldi, through Crystal, through the curated murmur of the city's most powerful people at leisure. For one terrible second, the Aurelian Grill went silent. Then someone laughed, and the silence shattered into something worse. Jane Galvan hit the cold marble floor with both hands already moving, one to break the fall, one to shield the 8-month curve of her belly. Her white service shirt had pulled free from her black apron. Her left cheek burned with the architecture of someone's wedding ring. The chandeliers above her swam in and out of focus, throwing gold light across the polished floor as if even the room itself was mocking her. Above her stood Mr. Elliot Sterling, general manager of the Aurelian Grill, his $3,000 Oxford shoe pressed into the soft space just below her ribs, not hard enough to break anything, just hard enough to remind her what she was. "You're fired, Jane," he announced to the room, not to her. He was performing the same way a man adjusts his tie after swatting a fly. "And since you love the floor so much, I'll help you find the gutter where you belong." The Aurelian Grill sat on the 54th floor of the Hainham Tower, where the air itself felt purchased. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls from 30-foot ceilings. Every table was set with hand-blown glassware and silverware that cost more than a working person's monthly rent. Tonight, those tables were full. Socialites, senators, the CEOs of companies whose names you'd recognize. They had come to be seen. And right now, what they were seeing was Jane Galvan. Her ponytail had come undone in the fall, her uniform strained across the swell of her pregnancy. Her expression caught between physical pain and something quieter, something unreadable made her look, to the watching crowd, like something to be pitied, or worse, entertained. Phones rose like a forest of glass and chrome. No one moved to help. This is the first lesson. Bystander apathy is not weakness. It is a performance of loyalty to whoever holds the power in the room. And every person in that dining room had just declared whose side they were on. Sterling gripped a fistful of Jane's hair and dragged her slowly, deliberately, like a man who wanted every table to witness the eviction through the gauntlet of laughing socialites toward the service exit. Her knees scraped the marble. Her free hand stayed locked around her belly. She did not scream. She did not plead. She looked at the clock on the far wall. 10:47 p.m. In 13 minutes, her husband was coming to pick her up. Jane Galvan did not beg. She did not cry. Because the woman being dragged through that restaurant was not a victim, she was the trigger. And the mechanism she had just set into motion made the Iron Lotus Society look like the hand of God. She allowed herself one thought as the cold night air hit her face and the service door swung shut behind her. They had no idea whose child they just threatened. Before we see Ji-sung walk through those doors, I need to ask you something. If you're still watching without subscribing, you're exactly like the crowd in that restaurant, present for everything, committed to nothing. Don't be that person. Hit that subscribe button. Prove you're not just a bystander, because what happens next will show you that the most dangerous people in any room are always the ones nobody took seriously. Power never announces itself. It simply arrives, and by the time the room understands what's standing in front of them, the exits are already sealed. Remember this: the hand you spit on today may be the one that signs your end tomorrow. They called her the Invisible Woman. Not to her face. They were never that direct, the wealthy rarely are. It was in the way they looked through her when she entered a room, the way they continued private conversations mid-sentence as she mopped beneath their tables, the way they handed her their used napkins without breaking eye contact with whoever they were charming. Jane Galvan had been scrubbing the floors of the Aurelian Grill for 6 days, and in that time not one person had learned her name. She preferred it that way. The device was smaller than a thumbnail, a matte black chip embedded in the underwire of her bra, directly over her sternum. Ji-sung's tech team had sewn it in themselves. It captured audio in a 30-foot radius and transmitted encrypted packets every 4 hours to a server in a building Jane had never visited and never would. All she had to do was be present, be ignored, be the woman pushing the mop through the background of other people's crimes. It was the easiest assignment she'd ever been given. It was also the one that required the most discipline. Because every night, Jane listened. She listened to the conversations that happened above her head while she wiped down baseboards, the casual mentions of wire transfers, of offshore accounts, of a shell company called Meridian Blue that existed nowhere on any public register. She listened to the maitre d' confirm a product shipment. In the same breath, he confirmed a reservation for 12. She listened to the laughter, the specific, performative laughter of people who have never once feared consequence. She scrubbed, she captured, she said nothing. By day 4, the subtle cruelties had developed their own rhythm. A busboy named Josh would, accidentally, leave the heaviest mop bucket at the far end of the hall for Jane to drag back. The head waitress, a woman named Christine, had taken to spilling small amounts of liquid near whatever section Jane had just finished, never enough to be obvious, always enough to send her back. One of the kitchen staff had started calling her the whale when she passed, quiet enough that she was meant to hear but no one else was meant to react. Jane noted each incident the way a scientist notes weather data, dispassionately, precisely. She was 8 months pregnant, her back ached in a way that had become its own background noise, and she was building a legal case that would eviscerate this restaurant's financial infrastructure before her husband's people ever touched the building physically. She did not have the luxury of feelings. On the 6th night, she allowed herself one small indulgence. She pressed her palm flat against her belly during a quiet moment in the supply closet, felt the answering push of a foot or a fist from inside, and whispered, "Almost done, little one. Almost." Then she picked up her mop and went back to work. The influencer's name was Seo Yuna, and she had 4.2 million followers who believed she was a person of taste and substance. She wore a cream Bottega dress and had the particular confidence of someone who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. She was at the Aurelian Grill for content the restaurant's management had arranged a complimentary tasting in exchange for a post, which was the kind of transaction that passed for culture in certain circles. Jane was refilling the adjacent table's water when it happened. The glass tilted whether by accident or theater, Jane never determined, and a full pour of burgundy swept across the white tablecloth, over the edge, and directly onto Jane's uniform. The wine soaked through the white fabric immediately, spreading dark and cold across her chest and the top of her belly. Jane went still. The table went quiet. Every phone in a 10-foot radius shifted toward her. "Oh," Seo Yuna said. "Not sorry, just observational." Then she tilted her head, the way a person does when an idea arrives that they find amusing. "You should clean that up." She gestured toward the small pool of wine that had dripped from the tablecloth onto the marble. "Go on, down on your knees." The table laughed. Someone was definitely recording. Jane set the water pitcher down on the nearest surface with extreme care. She turned to face Seo Yuna directly, the first time in 6 days she had looked at anyone in this restaurant as an equal, and said, quietly and without heat, "I will get you a fresh glass. I will have someone bring new linens. I will not be getting on my knees." The silence that followed was a different kind from the one after the slap. This one was scandalized, offended, the sound of an order being refused by someone who was not supposed to have the option. "Excuse me?" Seo Yuna's voice had gone very thin and very sharp. "Do you know who I am?" "I know what you're asking me to do," Jane said. "The answer is no." That was when Elliot Sterling appeared. He had been watching from the host station. Jane understood that immediately. He had seen the wine spill, seen the phones go up, and made a calculation. Seo Yuna had 4.2 million followers. The Aurelian Grill had a brand to protect, and a pregnant cleaning woman who had just refused a direct order from a paying guest was, in Sterling's arithmetic, an asset that had turned liability. He crossed the dining room in long, purposeful strides, straightening his jacket as he walked. He was smiling when he arrived, but the smile was for the table, not for Jane. "I am so sorry," he said to Seo Yuna, as if Jane were not standing 18 inches away. "This will be handled immediately." Then he turned, and the smile was gone. What came next happened fast enough that the room processed it as a single event rather than a sequence. Sterling's hand closed around Jane's upper arm. He said, loud enough to carry, "You're done here." And then he was moving, pulling her behind him. And Jane was being hauled through the dining room like something removed from a table setting unwanted, disposable, already forgotten. She did not go silently, not because she lost control, because she needed witnesses. "My baby," she said loud and clear, to no one and everyone. "Please, be careful. I'm 8 months pregnant. Please." The room watched. The phones recorded. Sterling did not slow down. He said something about embarrassment. He said something about floors. He said the word pathetic. the way certain men say it not as description, but as verdict. His grip shifted from her arm to her hair, and the pain was immediate and clarifying, the kind that strips everything else away. Jane kept her free hand on her belly. She kept her voice even. She kept saying the words, "The baby, please, the baby." No one moved to help. This was the second lesson, and it was the same as the first. The service exit door swung open. The cold hit her like a sentence. The alley behind the Aurelian Grill smelled like industrial bins and rain. There was a dumpster to her left and a sodium light that flickered like it was deciding whether to stay on. Sterling deposited her into this setting with the finality of a man taking out the trash, which, Jane understood, was precisely how he had narrated this to himself. The door swung shut. The lock clicked. She stood in the rain for a moment without moving. Her uniform was soaked through within 60 seconds. The wine stain on her chest spread and diluted into something pale and pink. Her knees had stopped bleeding. She hadn't noticed them start. The child inside her moved, a slow rotation, and Jane exhaled. "I know," she said quietly. "I know." She had planned to wait until the data collection was complete. 3 more days, and they would have had everything Ji-sung needed to move on Meridian Blue through the courts before the physical operation began. A clean sequence. Legal dismantlement first, then the other kind. That was the plan she had agreed to. That was the professional thing. She found the payphone at the end of the alley. It was the kind of infrastructure that wasn't supposed to exist anymore, which was precisely why Ji-sung's people had installed it there 6 months ago. For emergencies, for exactly this kind of moment. Jane stood in front of it for a long time. Then she picked up the receiver and dialed. Ji-sung was in the middle of a sentence when his private line rang. The boardroom on the 42nd floor of the Haenim Tower held 11 of the most dangerous financial minds in the Korean underground, and every one of them had learned, through various expensive lessons, that when Ji-sung was speaking, you did not interrupt. The sentence was about the Meridian Blue timeline. The call was from a number that did not exist in any directory. He stopped mid-word, looked at the phone, and picked it up. The people in that room would later describe what happened to his face as something they did not have language for. It wasn't rage. Rage is loud, performative, readable. What moved across Ji-sung's features was something colder and more total. The way a clear sky doesn't gradually become a storm, it simply is a storm, and you realize the change has already happened. He listened for 40 seconds. He said 4 words. "Are you and the baby safe?" He listened again. He said, "Stay on the line." Then he set the phone face down on the table, which was the signal. Director Yoon, his head of operations, was already standing. "Get me a car," Ji-sung said. His voice was the same volume it had been during the meeting. That was the part that frightened the room. "And call the council." He stood and straightened his jacket. Charcoal, bespoke, the Iron Lotus crest embroidered in black thread at the inside breast pocket, where no one could see it but him. The rings on his left hand caught the light as he moved. Heavy silver and onyx, each one a marker of something he had survived or seized. The scar above his left eye, a pale ridge that ran from brow to temple, had gone white, the way old wounds do when the blood drains from a face. He picked up the phone again. "I'm coming," he said. "Don't move." What left that boardroom was not the man who had walked in. Ji-sung, the husband, the man who brought Jane soup when her back ached and fell asleep with his hand on her belly, had stepped aside. What walked out through those doors, what nodded once to his waiting security and descended to the street without breaking stride, was something the city's underworld referred to, in whispers, as the ghost of soul. A man who had built an empire not through cruelty alone, but through the specific patience of someone who waits until the moment is right, and then removes every option simultaneously. By the time his car reached the bottom of the tower, 11 phones had already been dialed. By the time it turned onto the main avenue, the Iron Lotus Society had begun to move quietly, methodically, the way water moves before it becomes a flood. Credit lines were queried. Supplier contracts were flagged. The names of every person employed by, invested in, or associated with the Aurelian Grill were being compiled in a document that would take 4 people approximately 20 minutes to complete. Elliot Sterling would not know any of this yet. He was probably, at this moment, accepting the congratulations of CO Yuna's table for handling a difficult situation with such decisiveness. The city outside the car window was wet and bright, neon dissolving in the rain on every surface. Ji-sung watched it without expression. He had not yet decided how this would end for Sterling specifically. There were several available options, and each one needed to be proportional, documented, and final. He would decide when he saw Jane. Everything else could wait until then. The Aurelian Grill did not know it was already dead. That was the thing about the kind of destruction Ji-sung built. It didn't arrive with noise. It arrived the way a foundation crack arrives, invisible, structural, and by the time you see it on the surface, the damage beneath has already decided the outcome. While Sterling was accepting quiet congratulations from Seo Yuna's table, and the dining room had returned to its curated elegance, the machinery had already begun moving with the patience and precision of something that had never once needed to hurry. The first sign came at 11:14 p.m., when the restaurant's primary supplier, a premium produce company that had serviced the Aurelian Grill exclusively for 9 years, sent a terse email to the procurement manager, citing a contractual review. Period. Effective immediately. No explanation, no timeline, no person to call, just a polite, immovable wall where a relationship used to be. The second sign came 11 minutes later. The Aurelian Grill's corporate credit line, the one that processed payroll, supplier payments, and the monthly lease on the 54th floor returned an error code when the night manager attempted a routine transaction. He tried twice more, then called the bank. The representative who answered was apologetic and vague in equal measure. There was a flag on the account. It was being reviewed. These things sometimes took time. He was sorry for the inconvenience. The line disconnected before the manager could ask a follow-up question. The third sign was the lighting. It didn't go out. That would have been too obvious, too theatrical, and Ji-sung did not do theater. Instead, the system that controlled the Aurelian Grill's famously atmospheric dimming began to behave erratically. Tables that should have been bathed in warm gold flickered slightly, inconsistently, the way a candle behaves in a draft that no one can locate. The effect was subtle enough that most guests couldn't name what had changed, only that something had some quality of the room that had always been curated and certain now felt, faintly, provisional. The maitre d' called maintenance. Maintenance called the building's electrical contractor. The contractor's phone went to voicemail. A second contractor was tried. Same result. Sterling noticed none of this from his office. He was reviewing Seo Yuna's story, which had already posted the wine spill framed as a candid moment of spontaneity. The removal of a disruptive staff member described as the restaurant's celebrated commitment to its guests. 400,000 views in 40 minutes. The comments were approving. He was pleased with himself in the particular way of men who have confused performance with substance their entire careers. He poured himself a glass of the Grill's best scotch, leaned back in his chair, and thought about tomorrow's service. Outside, on the rain-slicked avenue below the Hainham Tower, 7 cars had already begun moving in formation, and 11 phones had already been answered. And the name Elliot Sterling had already been added to a document that no court would ever see, but whose conclusions were, nonetheless, absolute and final. The first vehicle arrived at the Aurelian Grill's private entrance at 11:51 p.m., then another. Then 4 more in succession, arranging themselves along the building's perimeter with the quiet, unhurried precision of a military operation that had been rehearsed enough times to no longer require urgency. Black cars, no visible plates, the kind of vehicles that existed in the city's peripheral vision, present but not registered, the way certain truths are present but not registered until the window for doing anything about them has already closed. The doorman noticed first. He was a large man who had worked the entrance of the Aurelian Grill for 6 years, and had handled his share of difficult guests and difficult situations, and he stepped toward the lead vehicle to request that the driver move, because the valet lane was for ticketed guests only. Then the passenger door of the lead car opened, and the man who stepped out looked at him once, not threateningly, not with any visible hostility, just looked, and the doorman stepped back and said nothing, and would continue saying nothing for the remainder of the evening. Inside, Sterling's deputy, a man named Park, was the one who brought the news upstairs. He knocked twice, entered without waiting, and said, "There are cars outside. 11 of them now, positioned at every entrance. They are not moving, and the men standing beside them are not guests." He paused, searching for professional language that could contain what he had seen and finding none. "They are not the kind of men you ask to move." Sterling came to the window. He counted the vehicles. He counted the men posted at every entrance and exit, the service alley included, the loading dock, the emergency stairwell exits at street level. They stood in the rain without umbrellas in the particular, practiced stillness of people who have spent years learning how to occupy space without announcing themselves. Then his eyes found the crest on the lead car's door, small, embossed in silver, catching the amber of the streetlight. A lotus flower rendered in a specific geometric style that belonged to exactly one organization in this city. Sterling had lived in Seoul his entire adult life. He recognized that crest the way you recognize something you have always hoped to never see up close. The Scotch glass was still in his hand. He set it down on the windowsill very carefully, the way a person sets something down when they need their hands free but do not yet know for what purpose. "Call the police," he said. Park was already shaking his head before the sentence finished. "I tried. The call connected. Then it went quiet. Then the line dropped. I tried a second number. Same result." This was the third lesson, and it was the most important one of the evening. There is a difference between power and authority. Authority is granted by institutions. It can be called upon, petitioned, appealed to, invoked when needed. Power is structural. It is already inside the institutions you are calling. It answers the phone before you do. By the time Sterling had reached for his phone, the Iron Lotus Society had already had its conversations with the people whose job it would otherwise have been to respond to his. He was standing in a room that had no doors. He simply had not understood that yet. Ji-sung entered the Aurelian Grill at 12:07 a.m. He came through the main entrance, alone, without announcement, because he did not need anyone with him, and he had never in his life required an entrance to be prepared for him. The dining room was still partially populated, late tables finishing dessert, the bar crowd thinning, staff beginning the early mechanical stages of closing. They all went still in the particular way that every living thing goes still when it registers the presence of something at the top of a hierarchy it didn't know it was part of, not from any conscious decision. From something older and more honest than thought. He was not loud. He carried no visible weapon. He walked with his hands at his sides, and his face held the same expression it had carried since the phone call. Not rage, not grief, but the absolute navigational calm of a man who has already moved through his emotions and arrived at execution. The charcoal suit was the same one he had worn in the boardroom 3 hours earlier. The iron lotus rings on his left hand caught the light from the chandeliers as he moved heavy silver and dark stone, each one a marker of something survived or seized or decided. The scar above his left eye, that pale ridge running from brow to temple, had gone white the way old wounds do when the blood drains from a face entirely. He looked at the room once, taking inventory. Then he walked to a specific table, not the best table, not the most prominent position in the room. The table in the northeast corner, near the service corridor entrance, the one with a faint streak on the baseboard where years of cleaning product had never quite restored the original finish. The table that Jane had scrubbed on her knees every night for 6 days, while the people above her conducted their quiet crimes and their louder cruelties. He sat down. He adjusted the placement of the cutlery in front of him, straightening it with one finger, an almost domestic gesture that terrified the room more than anything theatrical could have. Then he looked up at the nearest server, a young woman whose face had gone completely bloodless, and said, in a voice calibrated for that table and no further, "Bring me the manager. And bring me the woman he broke tonight." They brought Sterling first, because Jane was not yet ready to enter, and because Ji-sung had intended it that way. Sterling arrived with the performance of a man who had made a decision, somewhere between the office and the dining room floor, that his best remaining option was to project authority. He had straightened his jacket. He had prepared his voice, the one he used with difficult guests, warm but bounded, managerial, the voice of a man who controlled his environment. He was going to explain that there had been a misunderstanding. He was going to reference the staff conduct policies he was well within his rights to enforce. He was going to... He saw Ji-sung's hands on the table. The rings, the tattoos running from knuckle to wrist. Dragon and lotus intertwined in the particular style that took years to complete, and meant something specific about the level of commitment the wearer had made, and the things he had done to earn that commitment. He saw the scar. He saw the eyes dark, still, and pointed at him with the fixed attention of someone who has already finished the calculation and is simply waiting for the formality of the conversation to conclude. Elliot Sterling's prepared voice did not arrive. Ji-sung did not stand. He did not raise his voice. He said, simply, "Sit down." And Sterling sat, because the body sometimes understands the situation before the ego is willing to accept it. The woman you dragged through this room tonight, Ji-sung said. She is my wife. The child she is carrying is my child. He allowed that to occupy the air between them for a moment, unhurried, the way a judge allows a verdict to land before continuing. I want you to understand what that means before anything else proceeds. Not so you can explain yourself, there is no explanation I am interested in hearing. I want you to understand it so that you are fully present for what comes next. So that later, when you are trying to make sense of how everything you built disappeared, you will know exactly where it started. It started tonight. It started with her. Sterling's mouth opened. Don't, Ji-sung said. He didn't. She came through the main entrance at 12:19 a.m., and this time the room did not go still. The room stopped completely, thoroughly, as if someone had reached into the building's atmosphere and removed the permission for anything ordinary to continue occurring. Jane Galvin walked through the doors of the Aurelian Grill in a gown the color of deep water silk that moved with its own gravity, unhurried and absolute. Diamonds at her throat caught the chandelier light and scattered it across the marble in small, cold points of brightness. Her hair was up, precisely arranged, not a single element of her appearance accidental. The hand resting at her side bore the iron lotus ring Ji-sung had placed there on their wedding day, the one she had removed and locked away before her first shift at this restaurant, because she had not wanted any part of that identity available to her while she was learning what the world looked like without it. She had earned the right to put it back on. 4 of Ji-sung's most senior guards flanked her, not hovering, not anxious, not performing protection, present the way the walls of a palace are present, not barriers, architecture. She walked through the dining room at the pace of someone who has never once in her life been required to move faster than she chose to. Past the table where Seo Yuna sat with her phone face down and her expensive dress suddenly feeling like a costume. Past the section where Christine, the head waitress, had pressed herself against the wall near the service corridor and was discovering that the corridor was not available as an exit. Past the bar, where the late crowd had gone collectively silent in the particular way of witnesses who understand they are watching something they will spend years trying to describe accurately. Jane reached the table. She sat beside Ji-sung, and he took her hand without looking away from Sterling, and that single gesture, the unhurried, unperformative certainty of 2 people who know exactly who they are to each other, contained everything the room needed to understand and did not know how to hold. She looked around the dining room slowly, taking her time, meeting eyes where eyes were available to meet, and watching people look away, one by one, under the weight of their own recognition. They were processing it in sequence, the way the mind handles information that rearranges too many things at once. The cleaning woman, the pregnancy, the uniform stretched over her belly, the wine on her chest, the hair, the floor, and now the silk, the diamonds, the guards, the man across the table who had not blinked since he sat down. And underneath all of that, the understanding that they had filmed it. That they had raised their glasses and laughed and pointed their phones at a woman being dragged across a floor, and the woman had known, every single second, exactly who she was. Jane let them sit with that. Then she looked at Sterling directly, for the second time that evening. The first time had been when she refused to get on her knees. This time was different. This time she was not refusing anything. She was simply delivering a conclusion. She placed the matte black device on the table between them. 36 hours of audio, meridian blue, documented in the voices of the people who had built it and maintained it and celebrated it. Captured while a pregnant woman scrubbed their floors, and they talked freely above her head because they had decided she was not worth the effort of noticing. You wanted to know if I loved the floor, Jane said. I was studying it, along with everything else in this building. This is the lesson underneath the story, the one that matters more than the revenge. Jane Galvan was the wife of the most powerful man in the city's underworld. She had access to resources most people spend their entire lives unable to imagine. She had never needed to work for a salary, not financially, not practically, not in any conventional sense. Ji-sung had offered her every comfort available to a person of his position, and she had accepted those comforts with gratitude and without guilt. And then, 7 months into her pregnancy, she had asked him to help her disappear into a uniform. She had explained it to him at their kitchen table at 2 a.m, with her hands around a cup of tea and her belly just beginning to announce itself against the fabric of her shirt. She had grown up poor. Genuinely, specifically poor, the kind that means choosing between the electricity bill and the school trip, the kind that makes you an expert in invisibility before you are old enough to name what you are doing. Ji-sung's world had lifted her out of that life completely, and she was grateful for it, and she was also afraid of something the gratitude couldn't reach. She was afraid of forgetting. Power insulates, she told him. It's supposed to. But insulation makes you blind to what other people actually experience. And I am about to raise a child inside the most insulated environment in this city. She looked at him steadily. I don't want our child taught about dignity and humility by someone who has only read about them. I need to remember what it feels like to have neither. I need to feel it again, properly, so I can teach it honestly. She had chosen the Aurelian Grill specifically because it was the most extreme version of the environment she was describing, the place where the gap between those with power and those without was most visible, most theatrical, most deliberately maintained. She needed the full dose. She needed to know, without any protection available to her, how the world treated a person it had decided did not matter. Ji-sung had been quiet for a long time after she finished, long enough that she had started to prepare for the argument. Then he said, I will be watching from a distance the entire time. Not a question, a negotiation. I know, she said, but don't interfere unless I call. He agreed, because he understood that what she was doing was not reckless or sentimental. It was the most deliberate act of preparation she could have given their child the decision to go back into the fire voluntarily, to remember the burn, so that the person she raised would be led by someone who had chosen understanding over comfort, when it would have been very easy to choose otherwise. The Meridian Blue intelligence was real, and it was valuable, and it served its purpose, but it was not why she went. She went because she loved her child more than she loved her own safety, and she understood that the most dangerous thing she could pass on was a version of power that had lost its memory of what it felt like to be without it. Ji-sung and Jane left the restaurant at 1:03 a.m. He had his hand at the small of her back. She carried nothing. The device had served its purpose and been left on the table where it belonged, among the wreckage of other people's certainties. Outside, the rain had softened to something lighter and more patient, and Seoul at that hour was the way it always is, honest and indifferent, and populated by millions of people living their invisible, unglamorous, irreplaceable lives. In the car, Jane leaned her head against Ji-sung's shoulder and guided his hand to her belly, pressing his palm flat against the place where their child had been present for all of it. They both felt the response steady, insistent, a small body already practicing the particular stubbornness of someone who intends, when the time comes, to take up exactly as much space as they deserve. She's going to know what it costs to be treated like a person, Jane said quietly to the rain on the window. I'm going to make sure she knows what that feels like from both sides, so she never forgets which side she came from. Ji-sung was quiet for a moment, then, she already knows, she was there for all of it. Jane closed her eyes. Outside, the city moved past them in light and water, and the iron lotus crest on the car door caught the glow of a street lamp once briefly, almost imperceptibly before the dark folded around it, and they became, to anyone watching, simply another car carrying ordinary people home through an ordinary night. That was always the point. That was what Jane had needed to remember, and what she would spend the rest of her life teaching, that the most powerful thing a person can do is choose, when no one is watching and nothing is required of them, to remain exactly who they are. The Aurelian Grill closed within the week, not loudly, not through any single dramatic gesture, but through the quiet and methodical withdrawal of every element that had sustained it. Suppliers did not return calls. The 54th floor lease was terminated through a legal instrument that took Ji-sung's attorneys 4 days to execute and Sterling's attorneys 4 weeks to fully understand. The Meridian Blue recordings were delivered to 3 separate regulatory bodies simultaneously, and the resulting investigation occupied prosecutors for the better part of 2 years and concluded with outcomes that Sterling's legal team had assured him, at the outset, were not possible. Sterling himself was left with a debt that consumed everything he had assembled across a 20-year career: the apartment in Gangnam, the investment portfolio, the industry reputation, the network of people who had admired and deferred to him. They disappeared the way water disappears from a cracked vessel, not all at once, but steadily, inevitably, until one day you reach for what was there and find only the shape of where it used to be. No one from the Aurelian Grill ever publicly connected their collapse to the Iron Lotus Society. There was nothing to connect. There was only a series of unfortunate and apparently unrelated events that had, taken together, added up to ruin.